Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Before we get here, we start here. This is always where it starts. This is more than just a piece of wood. It's a piece of us, crafted by those who learned from generations of crafters before them. It's a family tradition since 1884. This is Louisville Slugger. The one you think of when you think of Bat's bat. Hell, the league's best hitters get an award every year with our name on it. Maybe we're boasting, but we've been building to this moment for 135 years. Griffey, Aaron, Williams, they saw their names on our bats and knew they made it. Because we made it. In a game of adjustments, we're no stranger to them. We innovate what's taken for granted. We'll never stop taking the next huge step. That's why the best players in the world swing the best bat we've ever made. That's how we get here. This is hard work. This is our time. This is Louisville Slugger.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hey now, everybody. How's it going? Welcome back to the box office. My name is Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. We appreciate it to no end. And, well, it's baseball playoff time, and we're celebrating with an interesting and intriguing look back, and hopefully a nice little backgrounder to any of the baseball playoff shenanigans that you were enjoying out there, as we talk about the origin story and the baseball life of an interesting guy, a really interesting guy, not in the Hall of Fame in baseball. And we're going to get into maybe why not, and perhaps maybe an appreciation of that might get him back into the conversation about the Hall of Fame. His name was Pete Browning, and our guest this week is named Tim Newby. And he is no newbie to this story of the original Louisville Slugger. That's the name of the book. And basically, that is the nickname, the background of this baseball legend by the name of Pete Browning. By many accounts, if not most trusted sources, Pete Browning was the origin of what ultimately became today's Louisville Slugger baseball bat and company and story. Very much part of baseball's history and lore. And the story of this guy as a player and as an influencer in the earliest days of baseball, starting from the late 1880s through the early 1890s, mostly playing. But he was also an interesting guy on a lot of different levels. He had a lifetime batting average of 341, over 650 runs batted in. And the interesting part of this legend, and we'll get into this conversation with Tim in a few moments' time. The legend has it that, the name of the company was Hillerich and Bradsby in Louisville, Kentucky. And during the 1880s, Hillerich, the guy who ran this thing, J.F. Hillerich was the guy. It was a woodworking shop in Louisville, Kentucky. The legend has it that Bud, his son, was playing baseball and slipped away from work one afternoon in 1884 to watch the then major league team in Louisville at the time, the American Association. We've talked a little bit about that, the Beer and Whiskey League, and saw this guy, the team's star, Pete Browning, who was in a hitting slump. And Bud invited Browning back to the shop and maybe, kind of helped him create a little bit of a bat more to his liking. And legend again has it that Browning accepted this offer and went back to the playing grounds with a couple of these bats and immediately broke out of his slump. And he started telling his friends, Browning did, and he told two friends, and so on and so on. There's been sort of other conjecture as to sort of how maybe some other players and some other people may have helped sort of get sort of the idea of a baseball bat and in a production kind of going. But Hillerich, the senior, wasn't all that interested in making bats. But by the time that Hillerich's son took over the company, he saw the future in producing baseball bats, and the legend was essentially born, and an industry really was born. Hillerich and Bradsby became the name of the company. That ultimately got sold to Wilson Sporting Goods, and Wilson, which is itself owned by another conglomerate, now oversees this. But Louisville Slugger, as you heard in that clip, is very much a brand name of renown amongst baseball players of all ilks, amateur, scholastic, and certainly at the pro level. There is a factory still making these things on a very sophisticated level and basis. There is an actual Louisville Slugger museum and factory in Louisville, where you can see, among other things, the world's largest baseball bat, which stands outside of the museum entrance there, right there on Main Street, downtown Louisville. But we're going to get into the story of the guy who is largely credited with creating the lore, the legacy, and the brand, I guess, if you will, and the raison d'etre, if you will, of these bats that are now legendary, known as the Louisville Slugger. And we're also going to talk about not only Browning's playing days. He played for the Eclipse of Louisville. He played for the Cleveland Infants of the short-lived Players League, which we've talked about previously. He played for a spell with the Pittsburgh Pirates, came back to Louisville to play for the American Association Colonels, got into the National League with the St. Louis Browns, and even the Brooklyn Grooms during these latter days of playing, which if you know your history correctly, they sort of became, what is today known as the Los Angeles Dodgers. So very interesting sort of a pedigree there. But also you will hear in this conversation a bunch of different things about Browning. Number one, did he get any credit and or financial gain from his birthing, shall we say, of what became the Louisville Slugger? You'll find out the answer to that, and you could probably guess he probably didn't get too much of that credit financially. And you will hear this in this story. Browning very much was a tremendous example of what a baseball player's life was like in the 1800s, in the 1880s, 1890s. It was a ragged existence, one rife with alcohol and rowdiness, and the beginning days, the very early vestiges of what was passing for quote unquote professional baseball at the time. And if you remember some of our previous conversations around this era, being a professional baseball player was not necessarily, and I'm putting that mildly, the most noble of professions. And I think exemplified by the up and down and sideways doings and career of one Pete Browning. So let's get into this story. Again, the book is just out. It's about a couple of weeks now. It is called The Original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Times of Forgotten Baseball Legend Pete Browning. It has got nonstop 5-star reviews on Amazon, and it's a very interesting tale. It's an interesting character, and don't let the 1880s and 1890s era history scare you away from this very interesting guy and interesting conversation. Here's our chat that we had with Tim Newby a few weeks back about the story of Pete Browning. Here it is. Please, as always, enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a bit of an understanding of who you are and what your adjunct into this curious character of Pete Browning, where it came from, what drives it, and more importantly, what sort of, put you over the edge to kind of, go deep onto his life and times.
Sure. I kind of stumbled onto Pete. I had just had my second book published, which was Leftover Salmon, 30 Years of Festival, which is about a band, Leftover Salmon, which you may or may not be familiar with, but they're in that kind of that world with like Fish and Widespread Panic and, kind of an offshoot area of like the Grateful Dead in there, like Americana. And I usually tend to write more about music. I write for Bluegrass Unlimited. I've written for Paste. My first book was about bluegrass in Baltimore. So I tend to more write about that. That doesn't mean I don't write about sports and baseball and do those types of things. It just tends to be more what I normally do. But so we were kind of the second book had come out, and as part of it, it was the band's 30th anniversary tour. So I was out on the road with the band, and each night, like I would kind of open up the show, talking, reading from the book, and then they would kind of play and talk about their history. And we had just finished up a show at the Ryman, and my wife and I were going to take like a road trip afterwards up to Kentucky, and we went up to Romp Fest in Owensboro, and we ended up in Louisville, and we were just doing the touristy thing, and we had done the Slugger Museum. And I was vaguely familiar with Pete as a baseball fan. I kind of knew the name was out there, but beyond that, I wasn't overly familiar. And while we're on the tour, they're kind of telling some stories about him. And my wife kind of, was nudging me like, wow, this guy's pretty interesting. And I was kind of in my head, kind of thinking about what I would like to write about next. So I remember at dinner that night, we were sitting there and just kind of like while we're eating and, having some beers, like goofing around, like on our phones, like looking up stuff about Pete. And, there's some kind of humorous stories. And I was like, wow, like I really like this. And his kind of seemed to have an interesting story. So I thought, well, let me take the rest of the summer and see if maybe there's a reason why there's nothing out there on him. There's not a lot on him. And I thought, well, maybe it's just because he's a 19th century ball player. Maybe his story isn't very interesting beyond what we heard, today. So I took the rest of the summer and I just really liked his story. And to me, there was a lot there. And his story spoke to what is the bigger thing I like to write about, which is often subjects that are kind of overlooked and forgotten and maybe underrated with what they do. He's this 19th century ball player who was one of the best hitters of the era. And he has, all of these crazy things in his life. And he is known for being the Louisville Slugger. And he overcame all these hardships, health issues and alcoholism and all these types of things like that. And it's a story that kind of really spoke to me. And that really just, kind of sent me down that path. And then as I was writing about him, I just realized there were so many other avenues in it. Like as baseball fans, most people are kind of really unfamiliar with 19th century baseball. And it's such a different looking game. And, we usually just think of kind of that modern 20th century era and we know what it looks like and what baseball, how it is. But this era with like no gloves and, no pitching mounds for a while and pitching boxes and all these different things was a really interesting avenue as well. So this whole thing came together of like Pete and who he is and all he overcame. And then, the story of the evolution of baseball. And then what becomes the bigger part of the story is there's all these like myths and legends of Pete. And almost like, where's that line between myth and truth with Pete? Like, Pete in general consciousness is more myth than fact. And I wanted to try and find out where that line is between those. And then at the same time, like, what is the reason for some of these myths and legends? Is there a reason? Was it just a story made up, or was there a reason he acted or did these things that way? And so all those kind of came in to end up telling the story of Pete, who is the original Louisville Slugger.
Well, it's interesting. You did mention Louisville, right? So having lived there for a little bit, it's pretty interesting to see just how important sort of that Slugger history is to that city. Obviously has been a pretty strong minor league baseball town for quite some time. But I'm wondering if you hadn't gone to Louisville, would you have stumbled across the story as much? My sense is that the story of Louisville and sports is probably is almost enormously intertwined with his life as well during that period that he was alive, but then ever since too, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, yes, I don't think I would have stumbled on this story if we hadn't visited. And his story is very much intertwined. I mean, besides being his hometown, for a number of reasons, he was way more comfortable at home, and he had opportunities to leave and play elsewhere, and he didn't really take those opportunities until towards the end of his career. And I think it is a little overlooked that Louisville at the time, I mean, they were, a charter member of the National League. They have a gambling scandal, and they have some pretty big name players that come through there. I mean, Honus Wagner starts his career there. So they have a role in Major League Baseball in the 19th century. I mean, they were a major kind of player in that. They win a World Series in the American Association in 1890. So they had a role. I mean, it's become obviously kind of forgotten, overlooked as they've had, no longer play in the major leagues and just have minor league teams. But at that time, they were definitely an important team and city. And besides Pete, they had a number of players who were pretty well known of the era. I mean, they as a team, for the most part, they kind of underachieved, I think. But they had some really great players. Guy Hecker and Tony Mullane played a year there, and Chicken Wolf was another character who had a really great career there. So they have this nice history of baseball in the city.
Well, so let's put this in context a little bit, right? So we're talking about obviously the late 1800s when, baseball was really just kind of feeling its way through to this thing called professionalism, right? Which at the time, right, was certainly questionable. It wasn't even a real noble profession per se. Matter of fact, it was by many people's standards, it was pretty much the opposite, right? Because it was unruly and the behavior and the types of people that it attracted to play and the very idea that you could get
gambling and drinking,
gambling and drinking and all that. God, the drinking on this establishment, I'm shocked. But maybe put a little bit of context into that. We don't have to get the entire history of the 1800s version of professional baseball, but there's no question, right? A lot of rowdy kind of player types, a lot of drinking, a lot of gambling, and all that kind of stuff, and not a lot of rules per se in and around the time that Pete was playing.
I mean, if you mean rules with drinking, like there are teams that they definitely tried to institute some rules, but it becomes a fine line, right? When your best player is your best drinker, so to speak, like how do you handle that? And so they did. I mean, Pete got suspended a number of times when they finally had enough of that. But yeah, there was definitely kind of a stigma attached to that. And that becomes kind of an interesting part of the story as well, is you have this evolution of the American Association, which some people assume is the American League, but it's not. It was a separate league that dissolved. So it's not the same thing despite being the American Association. But the American Association was built as like a competitor of the National League. And they actually tried to appeal to some of those kind of like more like blue collar, like middle class standards. Like they allowed alcohol in the stadiums and they had lower ticket prices. And those were things that like the National League wasn't doing at the time. So like, the American Association almost embraces this a little bit and, kind of turns a blind eye. And there's some fun stories in Louisville. They actually had a player, Joe Earhart, that they actually, as part of his pay, he got part of the receipts from the beer and alcohol sales at the stadium. Like that was kind of how they enticed him to come back to Louisville. So like, the American Association, while they didn't want their players, necessarily taking part of it, they definitely in a number of the original teams had some kind of ownership where they had some kind of stake in alcohol and liquor type related industries and stuff.
Yeah, and Browning's career too kind of is almost a bit emblematic of what it meant to be a player around that time. We're talking about the early 1880s through pretty much the middle part of 1890s, where there were a number of leagues and player contracts were not necessarily ironclad adhered to. As a matter of fact, even the Players League in 1890, which he was part of during its 1 year or ish existence, it was sort of an example of sort of the tension, I guess, between the owners and the players. Gee, some things don't change. But really the early expressions of that tension that would beset the sport and all of sports years down the road.
Well, and I think the Players League's a really interesting example, right? When we think of like holdouts now and strikes and stuff like that, it generally just revolves around pay, right? Players are just wanting to get paid more. There's some minor issues. But the Players League attempted to like literally challenge like the structure of it, right? They wanted to have their players and the owners be like more on equal standing. They didn't just want the players to be kind of like the hired labor or the hired workers. They kind of wanted to try and change that structure that, we still have today. And I mean, they should be commended for what they did. It ultimately wasn't successful for a number of reasons. And, the owners were able to kind of maintain their power. But the Players League is a very interesting concept at the time where the players wanted to have this league and they found, owners who were willing to help kind of support that and be part of that. And, they were raising money. And it's an interesting era. You have 3 professional leagues, and the Players League was arguably the most talented of all of the time because it drew those players in who thought there was going to be more money there, and they want to play in this league where they can do that. And on the side note, Pete wins a batting title in this kind of uber talented league.
Yeah, for a team called the Cleveland Infants, which we love to we love to regale in all kinds of teams and leagues and stuff that don't exist anymore, and this is a perfect example. But let's double click on that a little bit, right? So we not only was he the batting champion of the Players League in 1890, but he was also batting champion in 2 different seasons in the American Association. Again, not to be confused with the American League, and his prowess, let's get into him a little bit more specifically. Browning's prowess was indeed as a slugger, right? I mean, I think people kind of assume that with the Louisville Slugger connotation, but maybe a little bit of background about his skill set in the sport, and maybe a little bit too about how he gets this nickname. It's not just because he was born and raised in Louisville.
So yeah, I mean, he is one of the best hitters of that time period. So as you said, he won a batting title his rookie year with the monster season in 1882. He wins another batting title in 1885. In 1886, he misses out on the batting title by basically 1 point, what figures out to almost like 1 hit to his teammate. So he was basically just a whisker away from winning back to bite it back, and would have been his 3rd in 4 years. In 1887. He hits over 400, sets career highs in every single category, and he just happens to run into the even better year of Tip O'Neill. So again, he is just a whisker away from winning 3 batting titles. 1888, he finishes 3rd. We start seeing a little bit of a regression. He has his drinking really starts becoming an issue. 1889 is just an utter disaster for he and the city of Louisville as baseball. They still hold the all-time record for consecutive losses at 26. That becomes the first season of his pro career where he does not hit over 300. And where he does not finish in the top 3 in hitting. In 1890, he goes out and wins a batting title in the Players League, which again was arguably the most talented league at the time. The following year, he joins the National League for the first time, and he got up to a really slow start at the beginning of the year while playing in Pittsburgh. His health issues, which he had, which kind of dogged him his whole life, he had mastoiditis, really seemed to be bothering him early in the year. Pittsburgh was also a pretty awful team. He ends up moving to Cincinnati and has a really strong end of the year and ends up finishing 3rd in the batting race. His season got brought to an end. He got hit by a pitch by Kid Gleason. His season brought to an end. But again, he was pretty close to possibly another title. And if he wanted to win a batting title in the National League, he would have had 3 titles in 3 leagues, which is an impossibility these days, So he really was a dominant player of the era. His career kind of winds down pretty quickly after that. He had and we can kind of talk about that if you want. But that then kind of helps bring his career to an end. And by 1894, he's done in Major League Baseball. And he plays a few years in some of the other kind of circuits and stuff like that. But in 1894, he plays his last Major League Baseball, Major League games.
All right, well, let's talk about. His on base percentage, and he compares favorably, if not better, to a number of players that are either in the National Baseball Hall of Fame or of other of repute, right? So, I guess I'm really curious as to how he is such a dominant slugger at the plate, especially given his ailment, which is we should probably talk about it, mastoiditis, which maybe you want to explain for our listeners what that is. And it's something he suffered from a young age, but seemingly overcame for at least a period of his career.
I think it's something that's going to always dog him. So basically what it is he got an infection as a child. He gets mastoiditis, which is an infection of like the mastoid bone behind your ear. So basically what it does, it's going to cause him hearing loss. By the time he's a teenager, he's probably mostly deaf. It caused him to have severe headaches, caused him to have vertigo at times. It caused kind of pain and swelling in his eyes. So he was dealing with that all the time. And then you figure this is in the 19th century, an era of some questionable medical practices. Nowadays, mastoiditis is a pretty simple, if you get an ear infection like that, you take penicillin and you're not going to worry about it. But penicillin, had not been discovered at the time. So he didn't have that. And at that time, it was a pretty common cause of death among children. So he kind of does this his whole life. It ends up setting a lot of who he is. His hearing loss is going to end up like dictating a lot of his behaviors going forward. Some of the stories about him on the field and things like that. Some of the ways that he conducted himself, I think, can be traced back to his lack of hearing. Some of the kind of more eccentric things he did that he was known to do, pouring buttermilk in his eyes and certain things like that. I think was a way he was trying to self-medicate when there was really no other way to alleviate some pain. He obviously turns to alcohol, which is a way to alleviate pain. So I think all of that really plays into it. And I think he battles it his entire life and his entire career. I mean, he gets a surgery in 1884 to try and relieve pain. So you're talking already 2 years into his career when he was just, 23 years old. He's already kind of getting surgery for there. And there's stories throughout his entire career about how he kind of dealt with it. There's stories that like the heat really caused him problems, and he was playing and there was some trees that cast shade onto the field, and he was standing back in the shade, and he was told like, hey, you need to move up, up here. And he's like, look, I can move up there, but he's like, if I get hot and I get dizzy, I'm not gonna be able to hit well. And what's more important, old Pete at the plate or Pete in the field. So I'm just gonna stand back here in the shade and save myself. So there's stories throughout his career, and sometimes those stories sound silly until you really think about the root of it. I mean, later in his career, he was known for stopping ground balls with his feet, which, it's hilarious, lazy Pete. But if you think about it, if you're battling vertigo and you bend over, that's only going to increase that vertigo, and you may fall over. So I think some of it was just a reason why he did that. His fielding was often criticized, despite the fact that early in his career he was playing shortstop and second base. But he did a lot of weird things. He was known to stand on one leg with his one foot pointing towards the direction of oncoming runners. Well, that sounds silly, but the simple reason was he couldn't hear runners approaching him, and he didn't want to get run over. He'd been run over a number of times, so it was a defense mechanism. He keeps eventually moving out of the base path and the base path further and further, and so people start criticizing his fielding, but there was a reason for that. They eventually move him to the outfield, and he still continues to stand kind of this way or not move, and the perception is he's lazy. But he just couldn't hear his teammates calling him off for a fly ball or deferring a fly ball, so he just stood there, and when he was questioned about it, he goes, look, anybody can run and chase, a fly ball down, but nobody can hit like old Pete. So I'm just going to stand here and save myself. But again, it was all kind of these health issues he's battling. And I think he just never could really admit that was a problem. He always kind of had this almost like boisterous defense mechanism as to why he did that. But it was something he battled his entire career. And it's a good question of what could he have been without that? I mean, there is some stories that his lack of hearing made him able to concentrate at the plate more, but I think that's just pure speculation. There's no he doesn't ever make those comments. I think we're just kind of speculating on that, but it's something that impacted him for his entire career, his entire life, and really impacted who he was as a man.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of amazing. I'm wondering, did his teammates, his coaches, the owners, the press even, did they cut him some slack? Did they kind of recognize or know that he had some of these disabilities, or was his batting prowess, for example, so amazing that they just kind of, wrote it off as just sort of, it's just the eccentricities of a player, and a pretty darn good one, especially offensively.
I don't think it was very well understood. There's some talk later on in his career when he's sick and things happening, but generally it seems when there was an issue, the first thing they went to is drinking, and it very well may have been. But like with his fielding, they would often criticize that. And that kind of becomes the myth of Pete's fielding. But if you really read every game, which I actually did, I literally went and went through every single one of his games and read every game story from multiple sources to try and get these stories here. He generally was pretty much praised for his athleticism in the field, but he was also kind of criticized for that laziness. And they didn't take into account he can't hear. So all of this is kind of after the fact, being able to understand what was truly kind of impacting him. I think the interesting thing about his lack of hearing is his name's not even Pete. I think we call him Pete Browning, but his name is Louis Rogers. The name Pete comes because he couldn't hear names of people when he was introduced, and he called everybody Pete, and the nickname just eventually kind of got put back onto him. So I don't think there was a lot of understanding or a lot of sympathy at the time, because it wasn't known how much it was impacting him until later on, when you kind of look at the whole picture and really understand how bad it was for him.
How much of his drinking problem, from what you were able to discern, do you think was him trying to self-medicate, among other things he was doing? You mentioned the buttermilk thing and the eye and whatever, to sort of deal with his difficulties. And how much do you think of it was just par for the course for the average baseball player at that time?
I mean, I definitely think it was par for the course. He starts drinking as a teenager pretty heavily, and I think it probably satisfied two real needs for him. Right, one, it's probably helping kind of numb some of this pain that he was in a lot of the time. But I also believe that he was actually a fairly shy individual, despite how boisterous he was at times. I think his boisterous nature was a bit of him overcoming, and he sounded loud because he's deaf, so he's just going to naturally be talking louder. So I think that gives him this kind of loud persona that he may have. But I also believe the drinking helped him overcome that shyness, and I believe that the boisterous nature he had, and he was known to talk about himself a lot, was because he couldn't hear. And if you can't hear a conversation, the easiest thing to do is just turn the conversation back to the one thing you know best, and that's yourself. So I think the alcohol really helped solve or help, with that a little bit, and then helped with kind of his health issues. And then I just think it was part of the culture of the times. Like, he eventually stops drinking in 1890. Now, how completely sober he was, will be unknown, but he seems to have been fairly sober. And he expressed a lot of concerns about, like, he was playing in Cleveland at the time and going out in public and almost like, could he do that? And being afraid that like a fan or somebody at the bar would spike his drink with something. So I think that, like, it was the culture. And when he stopped that, there was a little bit of a worry, like, how will I handle these things?
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. I guess we should probably get into a little bit more about where the Louisville Slugger thing comes from, because he among his idiosyncrasies, shall we say, was this particular attention to how he batted and what wood he used.
Yeah.
And I think that's the source. And man, it probably has just gotten more apocryphal since, but maybe you can get a little bit of the origin story, the best as you know it, for this Louisville Slugger appellation.
So the term Louisville Slugger was a nickname applied to him for the end of his career. It was just a headline in an article. Louisville Slugger, the hometown Louisville Slugger. So it was just a name that was applied to him. But how that becomes connected to what we know of as Louisville Slugger, the myth of it is, and I'll give you the myth and then I'll tell you where I have come down on this, is in 1884, Pete's in the midst of a slump and he breaks his bat. And Bud Hillerich, who was the son of J.F. Hillerich, who owned Hillerich Woodworking Company in Louisville, approached him and said, "Hey, I can turn you a bat." Well, J.F., the father, was against baseball for a number of the things we mentioned. The drinking under Pete's watchful eye, Bud, turns him a bat. And the next day, Pete goes out there and he gets 3 hits and he gets out of his slump. And like the idea that like we can make these bats, special is born. Now that's the myth. Now there is truth in there. I believe there is truth that he had that made. I don't think the story is quite that fanciful. More than likely what it was is Bud, who played baseball in the town at the time, probably knew Pete on some level. Pete broke a bat. Bud had been using some bats that he had been making at the factory himself. Bud approaches him or Pete approaches him and says to him, that war club you have, if I had one of those, I could really, sting some singles here. So then they go in and get it made. So while it may have not been the first bat they'd ever made, it was likely the first bat ever made to a player's specific specifications and requests. And then it does appear that over the next, decade of Pete's career, he gets bats regularly made from there. Now, there is no one kind of written evidence. And it's funny, I was at the Louisville Slugger this weekend, and we were kind of telling this story. And it kind of reminded me, I had some conversation with people, and it reminded me of some stuff my history professors always told me. And that sometimes we, as like historians and researchers, we want to find that fact and get all the way there, but we can't always get there. And so sometimes we have to get as close as we can, and in that last step, we got to take a leap of faith. So there was a lot of stories of Pete getting bats made by a Louisville firm throughout the rest of his career. When he's in Pittsburgh, there's a great story about how after a game, he was crying tears of joy because a package had been delivered with all these ash-colored bats, and he could just imagine all the triples and doubles he was going to hit. Now, it doesn't name Hillerich Company, but I think it's a fair stretch to say that's the company there. There's enough connection there. After his career, those connections start becoming greater. Hillerich Company in the 1890s starts now producing bats. They eventually will christen them Louisville Sluggers, but they first were making bats, and it does seem that Pete helped popularize that among other players. So that's kind of where the Louisville Slugger connection comes in. And then another kind of story that helps kind of make that leap of faith is Honus Wagner was in Louisville at the time after Pete had stopped playing. And I say stop playing because he really didn't retire. He just didn't have any other options. Nobody would sign him. And Pete kept all of his bats. He was notorious for his bats. And part of his thing with his bats, and it is really important for him, his players at the time just used whatever they could get. Well, Pete put thought into it. He thought that, if I'm playing a pitcher who's throwing faster, maybe I want to have a lighter bat or a longer bat or whatever it may be. Another side of Pete, and I'll get back to Honus here in a moment, is Pete couldn't admit when he wasn't doing well. So whenever he went into a slump, he just said the bat ran out of hits and I need another bat. So Pete had a collection of bats, hundreds of bats in his basement. Honus Wagner comes over and sees a bat that he really likes, and Pete was known to gift bats to people. He would give them away. So he gives them to Honus Wagner. Honus Wagner, a few years later, obviously is going to get his name on a bat and kind of become the first, person to endorse like the Louisville Slugger brand or what becomes that. And it's not out of the stretch of the imagination to imagine or figure that that's where he learned about the power or the beauty of those bats was through Pete, who kind of gave him one of those there. So that's where the connection comes from. In the kind of the 20s, in their advertising is the first time you really start seeing the company start making this connection to Pete. But it's also kind of when they start becoming kind of a national brand. There's a really good story in the 20s about a bunch of baseball dignitaries going to the company, and they tell this story about how Pete had gone there and had the first bat made to specification. So there's some debate over it. There's some people who believe, well, there's no evidence at the time that directly ties him to that. I am on the other side in that, there would be no, written evidence. Pete was illiterate, so he didn't write things down, and Bud was going against the wishes of his father, so I don't believe he's going to write it down. But then there's enough other evidence after that points back to this happening that I think it's easy to make that connection and say, yes, Pete had a bat made from there. Even if it wasn't the first one, he's probably the biggest name, the first one to have a bat made to specifications. And then he continues to go back and kind of helps them on their way as they start finding out that, maybe there's more money to be made in bats than there is in butter churns or chair legs or whatever it may be. So that's how it kind of comes into there. And over the years, there's stories of players, especially Arlie Latham, who tried to take claim for it. Arlie Latham and Pete seem to have a bit of a contentious relationship. And again, I don't think it's out of the realm of imagination to believe that Arlie was maybe taking a jab at his long-lost rival there a little bit when he started making claim, because he literally told exactly the story. Just it happened 2 months after Pete, and it wasn't while he was playing for a team in Louisville. So, Pete has his connection. He is the Louisville Slugger. He is kind of like the, whatever you want to say, like spirit animal for Louisville Slugger. He is kind of what they do and how they've evolved, what they've come, and that story, that myth, whatever the exact truth of it may be, is kind of the genesis for where that company is now.
Well, it's interesting. The company now is known as Hillerich and Bradsby
Mhm.
in Louisville. If I had the timing right? So he was kind of a big patron of their bats, right? He was almost like the first sports endorser, if you will. I got to think that, and then the company trademarked the name, and 10 years later, as sort of as an honorific for his patronage and capitalizing on his fame and all that. And um, I guess there are a couple of questions in there. Number one, how much was he helping him? Was he essentially kind of a nascent early days brand ambassador for this company? It seems like the company was ecstatic to have a guy like this, especially with such batting prowess, at least perhaps be somewhat associated with their bats. No?
Yeah, but you also have to remember throughout the 1880s, they aren't a bat company.
Fair enough.
So whatever level they're producing bats is not their main thing. Towards the end of the decade, beginning of the 1890s, they start getting into producing bats on some scale. But early on, I mean, and that I think that is the question, and there just will never be a good answer for that, is how much, because it's interesting because there's even some confusion on that, right? Bud's father, JF, like, he seems and has always told the story as that, like, he was against baseball, but then there is some stories where it seems that, like, he's taking claim for turning the first bat or having some ownership into it. So there's some confusion on that. So I would think in the 1880s, Pete was speaking of what the company could do, but they were not known as a bat company at the time. I mean, so it may have been as simple as Pete was getting bats made there and helping, he had no problem distributing to other people in the league. Louisville players were probably coming there because Pete had started there and probably getting them on some level. And there seems to be some kind of like definitely reporting in the papers at the time that players may have been kind of going there, getting bats made as well. Pete goes to Pittsburgh, which again, maybe is going to help spread that a little bit. But they, in the 1880s, were not a bat making company. So that's kind of the other argument too, is, one of the arguments is, well, how come in 1884 when Pete had this bat made, there's nothing in the papers? Well, how would Pete or Bud in 1884, when they were doing something that supposedly was supposed to be a secret, know what this company was going to become, 10, 15, 25, 50, 100 years later? So I think, that's the other thing to think about, is they were, kind of unaware of what this would actually blossom into, and the company doesn't become what it is until, well after Pete's, done playing and gone. And then they kind of, apply that Louisville Slugger name there. And it's a great name. I mean, it kind of allows the company to maintain those roots in their city, which, as we said, it's a little bit of a forgotten baseball town, but it also does tie back to that player who started it all.
Okay. So that said, my second question is this. He feels it sounds like he's responsible. Maybe looking back in history, there's a straight line, and maybe the actual story was not a clear one. But one would look at this story from a modern day perspective and say, sounds like Pete Browning was one of the chief reasons for the evolution or the even creation of this quote unquote Louisville Slugger line of baseball bats. Where's his sort of take on all of this, right? Shouldn't he have gotten some benefit from this, especially given his playing career was nearing an end when this line was launched, and arguably he could have been somehow financially benefited by this thing that he unwittingly helped create?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do. I think that's a really good question with that. I don't think that, like I said, they knew what it was going to be, what it was going to become from there, and it quite hadn't achieved that stature of it. I think what Pete should be given credit for is, 19th century baseball was this, weird era where the game is evolving into what we know as it today. And I do think Pete is a very important person in there, because at the time, bats and equipment in general just weren't really given the care that we think of. I mean, now players have, dozens of bats that they can use, and they're constantly pulling a new one out. But at the time, players didn't put that same care into it. And Pete really was the first person to kind of say, these are the tools of our trade. Maybe we should put some focus on them and not just be so cavalier in how we make them. So I think that almost should be his important part of his legacy as well, is that he helped change the perception of that. And it isn't like one shining moment where everyone, oh yes, Pete, you're right, but players kind of picked up on this and it slowly helps evolve. But I think it can be traced back to this moment of Pete really having care for his bat and being this kind of person who understood that, the player is important, but the equipment is also important.
Did he or is his heirs ever kind of latch on to this idea of, hey, wait a minute, he was responsible for kind of lighting the match for what became almost an industry.
So no, and the company really probably didn't have as national a stature until after he was gone. He dies in 1905, so he's going to kind of miss all that. And as far as heirs, he never married, never had children. And it was interesting this weekend at the Slugger Museum, we were actually kind of talking about that. And there just does not seem to be anybody. And he had brothers and sisters, and some of them had children, but there does not seem to be anybody who has any kind of familiar connection to him who comes out and necessarily takes ownership of that. Like there's not like, grandkids or cousins or anything like that really seems that. Like he had no children. He had some sisters who had no children. He had some brothers who had some children, but there does not seem to be anybody who really is coming out taking ownership and saying that, we need this. That the family there is, doesn't seem to be a lot of that family still there if they are there.
It's really interesting. I mean, you come from a marketing or business background, and one would look at that and go, "Ooh, wait a minute! It seems like the company got away with one there," and argue because look, this has been as well as anybody. There's a Louisville Slugger museum and factory, for God's sakes, and there's a gigantic replica of one of his namesake wooden bats, right? I think I think it's known for Guinness World Records as the largest bat in the world, but so there's this company is synonymous with this product and this name, and all these years later, you'd think there would be somebody doing some family tree research and goes, wait a minute, maybe, just maybe, we should have some kind of say or cut or something involved with this.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is interesting, kind of getting to the point you're saying there. Like most people, whether hardcore baseball fans or not, know the name Louisville Slugger. But very few people know that that's actually a person, that that there's a person behind that. There was a person who was that name. And it is interesting that there's, that's kind of the forgotten part of it. And the museum definitely has him prominently displayed as part of their history. And, he's all over the museum. And like you said, they have a display with him and he's very much a part of their history and lore. But generally speaking, most people have no idea that that's actually a person.
He also had another nickname. It was Gladiator. How did he come by that?
So, yeah, it's interesting. Louisville Slugger is a nickname that they use towards the end of his career, but interestingly enough, as that becomes the most kind of famous name he has on some level, it wasn't what was used the most. He had a lot of nicknames. They start calling the Gladiator in 1887. There's no clear moment of exactly why. It seems to be basically for kind of his combative personality and nature, whether it was his combative nature with the press, with, fly balls, with alcohol. But there's, it just kind of starts appearing. There's no real moment where it seems to be applied for any other reason than it was used in an article, and then it got picked up from there. More common than that, and through most of his career, he was simply called Old Pete. He was often called the Old Warhorse. So the Gladiator, I think, is kind of the most famous name, but that doesn't come until even 1887. I think the idea of Old Pete is he maybe seemed older than he was, but he actually, his rookie year, he's 18 years old. So he's a pretty young player. So, I think that the perception of him was that he was much older than he was. But yeah, the Gladiator is a nickname that got applied simply because of his combative nature with a lot of things, and it kind of stuck.
So, but his drinking caught up with him, and he died early, right? He died at what, 80 at 44 years of age?
Yeah, yep, in 1905, yes.
But how much of that do you think was because of his mastoiditis or complications from that, or was the drinking and those other other associated anesthesias, shall we say, self-medications, if you will? What do you think was really? And plus, he wasn't playing for a number of years. He was a cigar salesman and that kind of stuff. So that probably didn't help his ego much either psychologically.
Yeah, I don't think he necessarily had a very happy rest of his life. It wasn't like he had this miserable life, but he didn't have much outside of baseball. He tried some of the things, as you mentioned. He sold cigars. He owned a saloon for a while. There's stories of him working on a riverboat, but I don't think he generally had much else out besides baseball. He actually tried to become an umpire, and he actually was really always known for being very honest, but I think because of who he was as Pete, that was just never going to happen. His health-wise, towards the end, yes, I think all of that. The mastoiditis, they had opened him up and they found some tumors towards the end. Alcoholism, I mean, I think, when he dies, one paper just said he died from old age and raw liquor. And I think that might be the simplest thing there. But I think it's a combination of all those things. He definitely has some issues. He was institutionalized for a little bit, but it was less, I think, because there was any real psychiatric issue and just more because of a lack of understanding of what was going on. It appears he was definitely having some, major issues with his head, headaches and stuff like that. And he kind of had become withdrawn, probably depressed. And he was committed to a psychiatric institute for a little bit. But again, I think that was less to do with what was actually going on, and more has to do with a lack of understanding of all the health issues that were going on. There was even, stories that he died from like early symptoms of syphilis, which again may not be out of a realm of possibility, as he was known to enjoy his time at the brothels. But I think it's all of that. I just don't think he was that healthy by the end, and his body definitely kind of gave out.
Yeah, I was going to say that probably not too dissimilar from other players of that era, frankly. Similar things, right? Maybe not the condition that he suffered, but I can't imagine cirrhosis of the liver not being an issue for a lot of players, or syphilis or other STD type scenarios and stuff. I mean, this is a hard living kind of culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whether one wanted to be part of that off-field antic dynamic or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that, it's that there's no real one definitive answer. And then again, talking about the medical practices and understanding of the time, I don't think there's ever going to be one just kind of pure moment. I mean, he definitely seems to have been in, and not necessarily in like poor health, like was always bedridden, but he definitely seems to have kind of been worn down, and it all just eventually came to an end for him. And again, he drank hard. He was known to have started drinking at 15 years old and drank heavily. And his mastoiditis was definitely something that definitely weighed on him heavily and caused problems. I'm sure all that just psychologically helps wear you down a little bit and tires you out, so to speak.
All right, couple more questions, and I'll unabashedly promote. Not that we won't promote otherwise, but this is your opportunity to go deep on that. It seems to me that the investigation of this guy's life, right, probably led you down a lot of different rabbit holes of stories that were either true or not, or somewhere in between. What I'm trying to get at is that, how did you discern in your research the true stories from the possibly apocryphal? How does one divine the difference between those two, given this kind of a character that he was?
And that was a big goal of mine. And again, I wish that Pete had a diary and I could open it up and have those answers, and there wasn't there. So a lot of it was what you could find in the papers. And the papers you can always take with a grain of salt. But interestingly enough, you could find the same story told from 3 different angles from 3 different cities sometimes. And sometimes it would literally be the same story with just an addition of a couple lines in paragraph. So that was a big part of it, right? Because hometown papers were going to write about him in one way. Papers in Cincinnati were going to write about him in another way because that was kind of a rival and they were close. So they were going to write about him in different negative terms and maybe not gloss over some stuff as much. So a lot of it was just that. Then a lot of it was really taking these medical issues that he had and trying to get an understanding of that, and then seeing how it would affect or impact his daily life, and then seeing if there's an explanation for some of these behaviors that he hadn't. And I did actually talk to like an eye doctor about some stuff, like, hey, this pouring the buttermilk in the eyes, like, what about that? And so I tried to get a true understanding of all these things. Now, not that Pete had an understanding, but to kind of find out, well, would there have been some relief and would there have been that? So it was that. And as I said, unfortunately, with Pete, there's no one moment. There wasn't a chance I opened the book and there was the answer written in front of me. I wish there was, but a lot of times in research and history, when we're doing stuff, it's not there. We have to get all of our facts and read as much as we can, and then make that little bit of a leap of faith to say, well, we have all of this and they all point to this direction, so we can say this. And it may be wrong. I think in this situation, I like to believe I've got I understand Pete and his personality and who he was. And there was a few other sources out there, some letters and some stuff like that kind of gave you some insight. And I think really where you would find it at with some of these stories is there were stories of Pete that have kind of been like lasted throughout the years. The stories of him fishing in the gutter, it's hysterical. He was drunk, but he's sitting out in the streets against the wind fishing in the gutter. But they often don't ever really mention where that story comes from. And then going back, and as I said, I literally read through every single game he ever played and every day, and then finding that story. And sometimes those stories were vastly different. Sometimes you would find that. I think the two best instances of that is there was a story of him in Kansas City one time in 1888. After the game, he went and gathered up his fishing stuff, and he sat out front of the hotel with a cigar in hand and sat there and was fishing in the gutter, hoping to catch his dinner. It sounds hysterical. It's the funny drunk sitting out there. But that's not what happened. And there's pretty clear reporting that he had gathered up his stuff to go fishing and was drunk and passed out on the side of the street and had to be carried back to the hotel. But that's not the story they tell later on, right? And that kind of becomes almost a sad story and like speaks to his alcoholism. And then the other one is the most famous quote that's kind of attributed to him. Is he's always quoted as saying, "I can't hit until I hit the bottle." Oh, that's so funny, right? Before I walk up there and blast this triple, I got to go ahead and have a drink here, a little tonsil varnish so I can do this. But that's not what he said. In 1888, he was in a slump, and he had signed a temperance pledge and wasn't drinking. And he associated his lack of hitting with his lack of drinking. And what he actually said was, "I think I'm going to have to start drinking again so I can hit." And that's what he said. And that's kind of makes it a sad story. Here's this guy with this unbelievable talent who's associating his skill with drinking. So that's what I would try and find is those instances of the story there, like have the myth and then see if I can find back to that one little moment in there where maybe there was that exact truth. And sometimes it was the faith, and sometimes like these stories, you could literally go back and find what that story was. And to me, that was helping clear up that myth of who he was and then giving a better understanding of him. When he's saying things like that, you truly do understand that he also still is aware of the alcoholism, and that I have a problem, but I'm associating for the wrong reasons. But I do drink a lot, and there's something here. So that was really what it was in how I'm trying to separate these stories. And there's other stories about that where he would do things or say things that kind of got blown out of proportion. And then I also do believe that he was aware of the things he said sometimes and was happy to sort of have this image. And maybe he knew what he said, and he just wasn't going to, no press is bad press, I think, in Pete's eyes.
All right, can I throw out a few and just you give me a yay or nay in terms of its legitimate context?
Sure.
You think you hinted at this before, but did he speak to his bats and give them names?
He does. And again, I don't think, when you take it with the whole picture, it can seem really odd, but maybe he's walking up there speaking to it. But yes, there seems to be, he spoke to bats. He gave them biblical names. And again, he took a lot of ownerships with his bats. So I think it just helped him making a connection there. So that seems to be fairly true. Yes.
How about staring at the sun? There was this thing that perhaps by doing so, he fancied that his eyes would get stronger somehow.
Yeah. So he called his eyes his lamps, and he believed that they, obviously, which again gives some insight. Here's somebody who's a batter. Your eyes are really important, right? Keeping them, good so you can see. You've got to be able to see a ball coming. He also had pain with his eyes, so he had a lot of things. So it does appear that in addition to like staring at the sun to strengthen him, he poured buttermilk into him. He did things like when he was riding a train, he was hanging his head out the window, hoping to catch ash or cinder in there because that would help clear it out. When he smoked cigarettes, he would exhale the smoke out of his nose into his eyes, thinking that it would help clear them. So he did have a lot of weird quirks that seem related to his eyes. But again, it comes back to, I think, this issue that he, has this pain in there and he's trying to alleviate it. And then in his mind, he believes that if I stare at the sun, it's going to strengthen them. And if I have this pain in there, well, then maybe that pain's going to go away because I can stare at the sun and it makes them stronger. He walked and looked up at the sky when it rained in hopes it would clean them out. So yes, those were true.
That's interesting. I wonder where you get that kind of belief system there about your eyes. All right, here's the last one. And this is from Wikipedia, so it could be complete BS. But did he compute his average on his cuffs?
Yeah.
Okay. And for what reason? I guess he was number one. I'm guessing that implies that he had some kind of a computational skill. But two, it's probably because he knew he was doing pretty well at the plate, and probably wanted to make sure that the stats were correct and he can boast about it.
Well, and I think that's exactly what it was. Is he wanted to make sure that they were correct. This is an era when we don't have baseballreference.com to check, and we don't have everything computerized and all this. So I think. He was going to keep track of whether he had 2 or 3 hits to make sure that everybody got it right. And he complains one year, he says, I lost the batting title. And he was like, darn well that I had more hits than that. And he goes, I had written it on my sleeves and my cuffs. And he's like, but it got washed and it got taken away. So I can't prove that to anybody now. So yes, there is stories of that. There was even another story that he was on a ferry crossing the water, and they thought the ferry was going to sink or it was in a storm or something like that. And he wrote down some of his batting numbers on the door, thinking that if he went down, at least his numbers would be safe.
That is amazing. So, do you think there's any historical issue about maybe his stats being undercounted, perhaps because of that, or was that just more him worried about those stats not being captured?
I mean, I think here's all I can say, right? I mean, I think, statisticians and people in Sabre and all this have gone back and have looked at these games and have, to the best of what we have out there is known. I don't think, I mean, if the papers were off, I don't think they could be off by that much. That possibly, I think that generally they're probably pretty close. I mean, that's something that I just would never be able to say. I mean, Pete's going to complain about that, but I think he's going to complain about that because he always wanted to win a batting title. I mean, that was a pretty important thing to him. But I think they've gone back. I mean, even the year he hit 402 in 1887, they actually were counting walks as hits, and so they went back and actually refigured both all the stats that year, and both him and Tip O'Neill still hit over 400, even once you took out all the walks that have been counted as hits.
All right. Well, the gentleman has been dead for almost 120 some odd years now. And I guess to the outside observer, and I suspect also within the inner sanctum of Sabre and baseball historians and statisticians, the question is, and this is the final one, why, of course, is he not in the Baseball Hall of Fame, especially given, I mean, the stats seem to be pretty significant, especially in the slugging categories, and his outsized, contribution, if you will, to some of the lore of the game itself, right? Including this bat that, continues to live on and is revered as an essential sort of dynamic of part of the history of this game. Why is he not in the hall, do you think?
So he played the bulk of his career in the American Association, which was a competitor of the National League. And again, it's not the American League, it was a separate league. And when the Hall of Fame comes about in the 1930s, there was still a negative bias towards this American Association that had eventually dissolved in the 19th century. So a lot of those stats and records had kind of been forgotten about at the time. And I think there always was at the time, especially among those people there who maybe would have still been around from the 19th century. You may have had some sports writers and players who would have still been alive at that time. There was already a natural bias. So I think they weren't going to put anybody in from the American Association at first. And baseball scholarship then is not what it is now. And I think it took a long time to understand that, there's this guy who did have all these records in these recognized major leagues. And then that too, it doesn't seem the talent level between the two leagues was vastly different. Players would move back and forth and finish relatively in the same position. So I think it's taken a long time to kind of recognize that, because from American Association, there's a number of players who should be in, but there's not really many that are. The ones that are in are either in for other things or they spend a lot of their time in the National League. There's really only one player from the American Association who played the bulk and the best amount of his years in the American Association. So I think it's taken a long time to come to that. And then I think the other problem is we are now so far removed from that era. And I think it's hard to understand that. And I was talking with somebody one time about baseball, and they kind of said, well, don't we have enough 19th century baseball players in already? And I kind of disagree with that. Well, shouldn't we be trying to get all of them in? But I also understand, baseball struggles with the Hall of Fame every year, and we're getting a handful of people in. How do we go about and addressing that? And I think it's taken a long time for people to understand Pete. I mean, until the 21st century, I think we started getting a really good grasp of maybe his importance. But 19th century baseball in general, I think, is hard for people to grasp. So I think it's all of that, right? He, after he retired, he was a household name. And I had somebody tell me something really interesting of a good way to look at it. You can only compare a player to the generation before, their generation, and the generation after. Well, Pete doesn't really have a generation before. And the generation after, in the papers, he was still written about in glowing terms. But by the time you start getting to the 20s and 30s and 40s, he's forgotten because those sports writers wouldn't have known him. So they're making associations to another player. So as we move further and further away, he just becomes more and more forgotten. And I think it's hard, and people just don't have an awareness of what Pete was. And I think it's going to be a struggle for not just Pete, but any other 19th century player to get in. I mean, we're trying to get, figure out what to do with steroid era players and other players who are borderline. And, Del Murphy's still waiting for a call. So I think, I didn't write the book for this, but maybe this brings awareness, and, some people way above my pay grade sit down and go, let's really think about Pete. But I can't speak to if he ever will or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, I wrote it. I believe he should for all the things you mentioned, but I couldn't really say if he ever will. I think he probably won't, just because given, like I said, all the, how far away we are and how many players we're getting in each year, I think it's going to be an uphill battle for him.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one would hope. I mean, but you look at, and I'm not as expert about, this era as most of my guests have been, including yourself, right? But, I think if you were to ask somebody, an average sports fan with some passing understanding of baseball and baseball history, and you mention names like Dan Bruthers and, Roger Connor and Sam Thompson and, other contemporaries of that age. And then you mentioned Pete Browning, who, by the way, was essentially the guy who helped birth what is now known as the Louisville Slugger. Three of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. The other one isn't. And the one that's most known probably to the average fan or the average sports, person is this Pete Browning guy. So it's kind of, maybe it's obvious in retrospect, right? Maybe it takes a book like this. I mean, Lord knows the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League wasn't really remembered until a movie came out about them, right? Or the Negro Leagues with, Robert Peterson writing the book, and then, having the baseball documentary by Ken Burns devoting a wealth of time to it, right? I mean, sometimes it takes a relook or a rediscovery for people to kind of pay attention. I don't know. God forbid this book could do that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, that was definitely not my intention writing it. I mean, I thought I would like to bring attention to him. It definitely wasn't for a Hall of Fame thing, but I definitely had this discussion with people, and it would be great. I mean, who was the story of the Broncos running back? Was it Floyd Little, who kind of had the same thing? Like a story came out about him, and a writer, and again, I didn't do it for this, but like a writer started kind of really like putting his case, and next thing you know, like Floyd Little's in the Hall of Fame, right? So I think there are these cases of that. I mean, I think baseball is obviously tough because, Hall of Fame voting and when they vote and how long Pete's been gone. I think it's an interesting conversation on when they should have. I mean, maybe the solution is to sit down and just go, look, let's take care of the 19th century and make one last swoop at it and really figure it out, and then we can move on and put it behind us. Let's just correct any wrongs that we think we have and move on. But again, that's above my pay grade to make those decisions.
All right, our thanks to Tim, and an interesting character this Pete Rogers Browning was. And when you're in Louisville, you got to check out the Louisville Slugger Museum and Factory. Get yourself a couple of bats for yourself. See the world's largest baseball bat. See all the various history in there. Really interesting stuff. Tons of bats and famous usage, including a bunch from the recently departed, just this week as we're recording this, Pete Rose. Amazing things. There's exhibits like the history of the bat. You can actually hold various game-used bats from folks. You can kind of see what it's like to face a 90-plus mile per hour fastball. You can see some demonstrations of how old-time bats were made. There's a big collection there of bats. All kinds of cool stuff. It's a factory tour. Really, really cool stuff at the Louisville Slugger Museum and Factory, which is, where is it? 800 West Main Street in downtown Louisville. I think they said it was built in 1996, and you'll hear all about sort of, and I'm sure there's probably some discounts and stuff on how to get yourself some great bats from Hillerich and Bradsby as they still pump them out, and intriguingly and interestingly so. The book, though, of course, that before or after your trip there, that will set you up by our guest this week, Tim Newby. It is called The Original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Times of Forgotten Baseball Legend Pete Browning, and is published by our new friends at the University Press of Kentucky. And of course, you can find that wherever good books are found. Your local independent bookseller will be happy to order it for you, I'm sure. But of course, we would appreciate it if you went to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 364 with our pal Tim Newby, and you will find a couple of convenient links to that book at Amazon. You'll get either the paperback or the hardcover he says, or Kindle versions. And of course, you'll get it as quickly as humanly possible because, with the Amazon Prime thing, you usually get it very quickly, perhaps even same day, depending on the situation. And again, we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love when you do that. And God bless, because we can really use the coinage to help us keep our lights on here as we seek other ways at some point to help monetize this podcast beyond a couple of ads here and there and a couple of shekels of referral to Amazon as you make those purchases. Appreciated nonetheless, and keep them coming. But and by the way, keep all those referrals coming too. We appreciate it. Tell your friends. If you like what you hear, or there's an episode that you found pretty interesting, you think there's a fan in your life that may have a particular interest or intrigue around a team or a league or just general ephemera when it comes to things forgotten in sports, tip them off to our little show. Have them subscribe and follow us in their podcast feeds and give it a listen. If they like it, they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on. Email you can send us, of course, at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Again, our website is goodseatsstillavailable.com. The merch section is there for your perusal. Our friends at oldschoolshirts.com, Royal Retros, stuff from TeePublic, all there for you, and more to come there. We're going to build that out relatively soon. And some interesting goodies there. If you haven't already partaken, if that's a word, of those, please make yourself available to do so by going there. We appreciate that. If you're on the socials, you'll find us at various places. On the Twitter X thing, you'll find us at Good Seats Still, and you'll find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, including Twitch and Instagram and Facebook and the Threads thing. You can also find Tim Newby on Threads, Instagram, and the X Twitter thing. He's at Tim_Newby, Newby 9. Tim_Newby 9. The number 9. Yeah, there you go. What else? Thanks to Jerry Payne, Jerry Payne's audio excellence. He has successfully sweated it out, and we have seen the Atlanta Braves at least make the first round of the playoffs. As we record this, they are still alive. I cannot guarantee this by the time we drop this episode, but at least they made the playoffs. They can say they did, along with my trusty New York Mets, as previously predicted. Also still alive as the recording of this episode. Let us see. That's it for this week. We appreciate it. More fun to come. Much more stuff to come your way. Thank you for telling your friends and following us and putting us in your earbuds. We appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you and hearing you, or talking to you at least, next week. Take care and thank you.